should we talk about pirate radio now?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So can you give me an overview of just, what that is, how it all started?
Well, as mentioned, Roy Bates, was kind of looking for a more adventurous life to lead, money-making venture than the various kind of projects he was involved with, which were pretty interesting in their own right, like a rubber fin factory and harvesting white weed, this kind of strange plant-like thing that's used in bouquets. But at any rate, at the same time in the UK and starting in the 1960s, there's this pirate phenomenon called pirate radio because the BBC was the only licensed radio broadcaster in the UK at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Seriously, like there were no other radio stations on the airwaves, which again is kind of hard to even wrap your head around. But that meant that listeners were, of course, at the mercy of whatever the BBC wanted to play. And although they were known to play a few kind of pop programs here and there, there definitely wasn't any sort of consistency. And so to get around that, all of these enterprising young rock and rollers took to the water and built radio stations on old ships or on these forts, which were perfect for that.
Yeah.
And so they started doing these pirate broadcasting, which became huge cultural phenomenon. I mean, like the Beatles recorded greetings for some of the bigger stations. I mean, and ultimately, some fairly substantial amounts of money were involved because, again, this was like the only other alternative, and it was playing the most popular music of the day. So it got to be a pretty well-regarded phenomenon, not to say nothing of just how fun it must have been to be kind of engaged in this like Robin Hoodian type pursuit. And so all that to say, Roy Bates, who wasn't even necessarily a fan of rock and roll, still, of course, caught wind of this and took it upon himself to put together his own radio station. And as it happened, he lived not far from some of these forts, realized that it would be the perfect headquarters for an offshore station, theoretically outside of British jurisdiction. And so that's what, he muscled his way onto one of these forts. And that's where Radio Essex began, which is what he called his station.
Right. And then so was the reason that they would do these offshore or on a ship or something just because if they were broadcasting from England, they would just be shut down?
Right. I mean, there were a few laws on the books that gave, of course, British authority to govern their airwaves within British jurisdiction. At the time, though, the territorial limit for any country was about 3 miles. And so since some of these forts were 3 or more miles out to sea, the thinking was that, of course, we're in international waters, but close enough to broadcast, so it's a perfect space. And same thing with the ships. Obviously, we'll just sail beyond this limit and broadcast there, and there's nothing they could do. The British authorities could do about it.
Okay. So what? Yeah, because that seems I get that thinking, but to me, what was England's thought on it? Because it seems like they're, maybe you're broadcasting from here, but you're throwing your signal into our airspace.
Exactly. I think initially, and some of the paperwork related, or the communiques in the British archives relating to Sealand touched on this. It's like, wait a second, how do we handle this? Because they genuinely are in international waters, but like you said, they're broadcasting into the UK. So what do we do about it? And so there were a couple of years of head scratching, or at least, fairly, definitely some penalties given to these DJs, but nothing too serious. But then one DJ killed another, and there were fights on these forts for control of them, which seemed, starting to get a little hairy. And so the British government ramped up its efforts to clamp down on this. And so they passed some laws that made, funding one of these stations a crime, supplying them with equipment or food or fuel. The listeners' contracts with the BBC, you could buy BBC transmitters, allowed theoretically the government to confiscate it if they found out you were listening to illegal stuff. So although they couldn't do anything to stop people from broadcasting in international waters, they there were other ways to get at them that didn't require the government to go out into international waters. So they really seized on that to try to stop this.
Okay. No, that makes sense. So they kind of were able to indirectly kind of at least limit them.
Right.
Okay. And then so these forts are just like after the UK was done using them, they're just kind of sitting there vacant.
Right. And that factored into the somewhat confusing state of affairs as to who had control of them, because theoretically, if you build something in international waters, you're obligated to dismantle it once you're done. Since some of these forts were in international waters and the UK left them there, were they at fault somehow? And, kind of had to deal with the consequences. But on the other hand, it's like these forts really were in international waters. They sat abandoned for almost 2 decades before these radio pirates took control of them. So, they weren't nobody really cared about them until this pirate radio phenomenon happened. And again, all of the kind of battling out there that was required for it to allow these individual stations to hold on to their forts.
Yeah. That's so weird. Yeah, they're like just sitting there empty, and then they become like pretty valuable, basically. You need one.
Almost like priceless to a certain degree, because it's like how many freestanding, sturdy structures in international waters are there that are just sort of ripe for the taking. And so, that really part of what sort of solidified Roy Bates's reputation as a tough guy was the length that he and his crews would go to not only hold on to their fort, but take over. Long story short, they eventually took over a second fort that would become Sealand, and the wherewithal it took to do that was pretty remarkable, and lots of bloodied lips and black eyes, and even use of a flamethrower and Molotov cocktails in these battles. So again, it was like kind of a fun adventure, but also the stakes were pretty high. And again, the British government recognized that, which is kind of made the whole thing snowball into something a bit more serious.
Right. Yeah. No, these guys were they were hardcore about keeping these things and protecting them. Okay. Yeah. So Roy Bates, he decides to open up start his pirate radio called Radio Essex, and he does it on one of the forts called Knock John, right?
Right.
Okay, and then so he gets that actually up and running, but then what happens to that?
And so ultimately, he is fined for broadcasting because it was determined that this fort was just squeaked by the 3-mile limit, so it was within British territory. So he was fined and punished for that, and so that led him to look at Ruff's Tower, which would become Sealand, because that was almost 7 miles out to sea, irrefutably in international waters, and so that was even more valuable than Knock John, because it was truly in international waters, which once Radio Essex's original location was shut down, they sailed out to Ruff's Tower and took it over. And again, a fairly impressive show of force. And so that's how they ended up on the fort that would become Sealand.
Yeah. So there was somebody else occupying Ruff's Tower at the time, but they just kind of took it over.
Yep. And the legend goes that these hapless, because again, all these DJs working out there were, 19 to 23, fairly young dudes just living the rock and roll lifestyle. And so in the middle of the night, when these big burly guys just scale the side of this fort while, you're trying to cook dinner on a little tin or, a little heating tin, it's like, oh yeah, that's, okay, sure, you can have it. Just don't throw us over the side. So,
right. Yeah.
But, a lot of people also said that they really, Roy was just such a almost like legendary figure, because taking over one of these forts, all of a sudden he pops up over the side wearing like an immaculate suit like James Bond or something. So just he kind of crafted this legend for himself for being so antagonistic, not only toward other radio pirates but also toward the British government, who quickly kind of zeroed in on him and really tried to put this Ruff's Tower occupation to an end before it got out of hand again.
Right. Yeah. They weren't into having all this stuff going on, even if it was in international waters.
Especially because of that. Yeah, definitely.
Right. Okay. So they get on. He finally gets on Ruff's tower, but he doesn't actually start another station there, another radio station, does he?
No. By that point, the BBC finally wised up and was like, "Wait, why don't we just open some more radio stations for more variety?" And so so that's what they did. They started BBC 2, 3, and 4, which is still, of course, in operation today. And they poached a bunch of the DJs from these pirate radio stations and gave them much better paying jobs. And so the whole radio pirate phenomenon just kind of came to a natural end. And so that around the same time that Roy was going to get another station up and going, so it just wasn't worth it really. But he did win he was still holding on to this fort, and so that kind of set the stage for whatever would come next out there.
Yeah, so he's kind of got this fort, and then is that when he kind of starts to formulate the idea of Sealand and doing that whole thing?
Yeah, the idea was, I mean, he was, again, a patriotic soldier, a war hero. He'd fight in a war again for England as soon as he was called, he would say. So he was a little miffed that the British government was coming down so hard on him for simply trying to, provide for his family and provide, make some money for himself. And so I think, what would become, the idea of starting your own country wasn't necessarily the initial idea, but it was more just like, what can we do to give this fort a bigger footprint, or kind of throw our power around more. And so naturally, granting it some kind of sovereign status would endow it with that kind of like just power, I guess. So it was.
Hey, thanks for watching this video. This is my dog Murphy, and these are dog treats. Now I'll give Murphy one of these dog treats, and all you have to do is press the like button. Just press that little like button right down there at the bottom of this video, and this sweet, adorable, cute little puppy gets a treat. All thanks to you. All right, you did it? Okay, I believe you if you said you did it. There you go, Murph. She got that treat because of you. Now, I'll eat one of these treats, and all you have to do is click that subscribe button right there, pointing to it. Just click that subscribe button, subscribe to Curiosityness with me, Travis DeRose. Get lots of good video, and I'll eat this treat. All right, you did that too? That's not very good. Bro, not very good.